Hey, I'm Chris Zepp from Make Everything, and today we're going to recreate this 100-year-old door strike out of this solid piece of brass. Check it out. Okay, so before we get started, a little disclaimer. I am by no means a machinist. I have milling machines and I have lathes and I learn as I go. So this is going to be my version in my head on how to go about the operations to replicate this door strike. I hope you enjoy it. Okay, so this door strike came to me from an antique window restoration company. It's a local guy to me, and he repaired some French doors for a 100-year-old home in the town over. So this would be cast bronze initially. And you can see it's been heavily worn away. You know, there used to be a connecting bar here, and locksmiths have gotten at this thing to the point where there's really no material left here. Now, if you can imagine, when the door closes, the latch strike hits here, and then the deadbolt hits here. So the deadbolt completely relies on this flimsy piece of cast material to keep the door locked. So as you can imagine, the client wasn't happy with this after they restored their door. So he came to me and asked me to make him another one. I don't have any setups to do casting, and I don't have a CNC machine that can cut brass, so I'm going to do this all manually. He gave me some notes here that he wants to extend the leaves of this strike by 3/8 of an inch in either direction, and he does not want me to cut this out. Since it's going to be brass, it'll be easy for him to cut this and tune it when he gets it into the door jamb. Now, the only other thing that he told me that I don't need to do is mill out this back section, so I'm going to leave this solid. The piece of material I have here is 2-inch solid by 1-inch thick, 12-inch long. This is C360 brass. So what I'm going to do now is get some blue Dykem on this, do the layout, and get myself ready to start machining. All right, so I started here with the blue Dykem just to get my layout line scribed on here. And I know there's going to be some hate down in the comments, but I do like to use my calipers to do my scribe marks, and I'm using just a little machinist square and a needle scribe for those first marks, and then the calipers to do my layout. The first operation I'm going to do is I'm going to cut the material to a rough length, and then I'm actually going to resaw it on the bandsaw. I could have just face milled all of this off, but it was about 1/4 of an inch of material, so I figured why not try and get some use out of it. It took me about 5 minutes to resaw it, and while it didn't come out that great, I still did get some usable material that I'll be able to utilize somewhere else. So now that I have the piece resawed, I'm just checking to make sure I'm still a little bit oversized, and I head over to the Bridgeport. The Bridgeport is going to be not necessary for something like this. I could use one of the smaller mills, but the table's a little bit bigger, and I have a power feed on it. So the first tool that I'm going to be using is a shell mill, and that's just going to allow me to plane across the top of this material and get it all down to a consistent thickness, and then I can do a more refined layout. I'm raising the knee up so that there's minimal quill stick out. I want the quill to be tight in there, and I'm utilizing my power feed to just blaze across this with the mill and get that face flattened out. The shell mill leaves a beautiful finish on this brass. I actually could have been using a higher RPM, but this worked out fine. I really didn't feel like moving my belts around on the Bridgeport. So now that that is faced off, I take it back over to the table and just take some of the burrs off with a file and put some more layout fluid on there. Now again, I'm just going to take some measurements with my calipers and scribe those directly onto the piece of material. I don't have a DRO set up on the Bridgeport at the moment, so everything's going to be done manually. And there's really no point in drawing this thing and counting out the thousandths. I'm just going to run off of my scribe since I'm replicating a part. And here I'm just tracing the radius of the end mill that I'm going to be using so that I can get an idea of where it's going to pocket into those two radiused corners. So again, just using the needle scribe and scribing right into the Dykem and getting my final thickness scribed on the front edge.
And this is going to be important because when I put this in the vise, I'll be able to see this, and it'll help me get a nice reference so that I don't go too deep with any of my operations. So I change out my tool to a 3/4 inch 2-flute high-speed steel cutter, and I start removing my material. Now my machine was having a little bit of an issue at this point. I didn't realize it, but the tension on my drive belt had gotten really loose. So I should have been able to take really heavy cuts in this brass with the power feed running full tilt, and there shouldn't have been a problem at all. The belt being loose was causing it to slip. So what was happening was that as I was giving it a heavier feed and a heavier load, the machine was starting to bog down. And I thought that was weird. You know, I wasn't sure what was going on. I know my spindle speed was only about 1,000 RPMs. It could have been much higher to machine this brass, but I just really didn't think that the belt could have been loose. So after a couple of these operations, I tighten up the belt and I'm able to move much faster. The way that I'm doing this is I'm looking at my scribe lines constantly, and I'm just making sure that I'm staying off of them by about 5 thousandths. So I can see them still, and I'm not taking anything away. My idea is that these are basically roughing passes, and then I want to go back and clean everything up and make it perfect. The other concern is that I'm holding this thing pretty deep in the jaws, considering how thin it's going to be in the end. So I'm not machining super deep because I don't want to create a spring scenario where it closes in on itself. And you can see how much faster and harder I'm pushing the machine right now. This is after I realized the belt was loose and I tightened it up. And now I'm able to basically do whatever I want, whatever depth, whatever speed. The machine is just hogging right through this material, no problem. So I'm starting to take a little bit more of a refined cut at this point. I'm removing the material, and I'm getting closer to those scribe lines. Again, even the scribe lines that are on there are slightly oversized by maybe 2 or 3 thousandths. So I can go right up to them and I can just sort of sneak up on the lines, sneak up on my cuts, and get nice finish passes. The only thing that I want to make sure I preserve is that thickness at the bottom. I don't want to thin that out in any way. I want to make sure that I leave a good amount of heft there. Now I'm just repositioning it in the vise and getting it up a little bit higher so I can take more of that sidewall away. I don't want to have it sticking in too far out of the vise because I still want to be able to properly hold it, but I want to remove material safely. So here I'm just taking some passes on that sidewall, just taking away as much as I can until I bring the material up to the highest point. I'm using a little double parallel setup here because I don't have parallels that are that tall. Now I'm basically just grabbing the material below the scribe line for the final thickness. And at this point I can set my final depth on the cutter and make my final passes to plane everything down to the proper size. One of the things I should have done was I should have set up stops on the milling machine, which would have just made my life a little bit easier. But either way, the part came out pretty nice. I took it off the machine, did some measuring, and then brought it back on to just do 1 or 2 little cleanup passes on that internal radius, making sure everything was nice and lined up.
Okay, so everything's done over here on the milling machine, and I've got my basic shape. So everything was left oversized. You can see how the whole thing is actually a little bit longer than it needs to be. So now I can go back in and scribe all my tolerances and make sure everything's nice.
So now that I have the part, 99% machined, I just add a little bit more layout fluid and I scribe on some more lines that I'll be cutting out on the bandsaw. At this point, I'm totally done on the mill, which is a relief to me because of all the machines in my shop, the mill is sort of the least comfortable one for me. But the bandsaws and the sanders, I'll use those all day. So I'm just doing a little bit of math to add the 3/8 of an inch to the strike leaf, making sure that all my lines still leave me a little bit of tolerance, and I cut everything about 2 thousandths over the line, and then I'll go back with the sander and refine all these shapes to make them nice and square. I do this little trick with the 1, 2, 3 blocks on the sanders. I basically use their ground square edges to give me a perfect 90-degree reference against the sanding belt, and that allows me to grind things and make sure that they're dead square with the belt and then I can just sort of freehand using my scribe lines to get the rest of the profile refined. It's a little tricky to get some of these parts on the sander, but the 2x72 I've found to be the most versatile sander that I've ever owned. And now I'm just doing some layout for those holes. The client had asked me to drill and countersink for number 6 holes, so I used the number 25 drill, I believe, and I'm just center punching these, making sure that they're laid out in the center of those sections, and then I head over to the drill press with the number 25 and drill these out. Once those are drilled out, I'm using a single flute high-speed steel countersink to just give me a nice little countersink. And all these holes or countersinks could be chased by the client when he goes to install. The client actually is the window restorer, so he's familiar with this kind of work, and he should have no problem making this work for his application. I take it back over the table and just deburr everything with a nice fine file. And now I can bring it over into the sandblasting cabinet and sandblast away some of those heavy machining marks. I like to use the sandblaster on brass parts just because it cleans up any machining or any scratches on it and gives it all a consistent finish. And then I'll actually take it and use an orbital sander to get it up to more of a polish. You can see it's all black there. I tried to hit it on the buffer to see what would happen, and all it did was catch up all the buffing compounds, so I knew that wasn't going to work, so I just decided to hit it with the sander. I'm starting with 180 grit paper, and then I'll move up to a 220 grit paper. Once the 220 grit paper is sort of in there, I do a little bit of hand sanding, and then I'll switch over to a 400 grit wet paper, and that'll just give me a nice hand rubbed finish. Once that's done, it's going to go up to the buffer. Brass is super nice to work with. You can really refine the shape by hand. I love dealing with a metal that is worked like a wood. So now on the buffer, I'm just using some white compound and a loose buff, and this just brings the polish right up out of this brass from a 400 grit finish. It's really easy to get that luster to come up. There are a couple of nooks and crannies on this that are a little hard to get to, but overall the piece turned out beautiful. This is going to remain unlacquered, so it's going to tarnish and wear over time, and I really think it's going to look great in the client's brand new door jamb with their brand new restored French doors.
All right, that about does it for this video. I really enjoyed this little project. I learned a lot from this kind of stuff. You know, I'm not a machinist by any means, as I said in the beginning of the video. I learn as I go. I own my equipment and I learn how to use it, you know, from projects just like this. If you liked what you saw, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. If you want to see behind the scenes stuff, follow me on Instagram @MakeEverythingShop, and that's about it. So I hope to see you on the next video. Thanks.